So, hello, welcome to this Society is Greater Than Tech event on grassroots and community innovation. I'm Reefa, Head of Events at WiredSussex, and this event is part of an initiative to explore the impact of social science research that can have on the real world. So joining us in conversation are Professor Adrian Smith, co-author of Grassroots Innovation Movements and also part of the Science Policy Unit at University of Sussex, known as SPRU, and Rosie Sherry of Indie Hackers, the event Test Bash, and Ministry of Testing, which is the world's largest community of software testers. And I'm just going to hand over to Rosie Sherry.
Nice to be here. Okay, I'm going to do a quick intro and then pass it over to Adrian to do one as well. So I'm Rosie. I've been in Brighton for about 20 years now. I've been in tech for about 20 years now as well, which is a bit kind of scary. But most of my career, I started as a tester, and then I kind of moved into community stuff as I kind of discovered it, as Web 2.0 kind of came about around like 2007. So around that time, I kind of got inspired by all things community, and I was exploring lots of things. And one of the things that I decided to do was start a community for testers, because I was a tester myself. And then over the years, I just kind of kept working at it as a community and then as a business. And I managed to turn it into kind of like the biggest and probably most impactful testing community out there. And I did that, mostly myself, kind of like as an indie or bootstrap business. And I have done conferences literally like all over the world. So, in Europe, in the UK, in the States, in Australia, and New Zealand, we ended up going everywhere until COVID happened, obviously. But yeah, so that for me was kind of a journey, an interesting journey, tough but inspiring, and trying to figure out how to turn it into business was, it's not an easy task, I guess. And then after Ministry of Testing, which is still going, but I just don't run it day to day, I joined Indie Hackers a couple of years ago. Indie Hackers is a community that was acquired by Stripe. If you don't know Stripe, they're a fairly large US company who handle lots of online payments. You'll probably see them on checkouts everywhere. But the Indie Hackers was started by a guy called Cortland, and then shortly after he started it, it was acquired by Stripe. But the idea behind Indie Hackers was to create a community, and I guess a resource for people who are trying to kind of live more independently, who are trying to create businesses, profitable, independent businesses without relying on, I guess, like the traditional VC type route that has been so popular over the years. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I'll hand it over to Adrian now.
Thanks, Rosie, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining. Well, this afternoon here in Brighton, or wherever it is where you are. And as Reefa said, I'm a researcher at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, and actually, I've been working there around 20 years as well, Rosie. So we've been down in Brighton working away over a similar period, I think. And maybe 10 or so years ago, with a colleague, Jill Seafang, at University of East Anglia, we were doing work looking at local environmental activism and projects. So, community food projects or community energy, eco-housing neighbourhoods that were happening at grassroots level. And we became interested in not just studying them as sort of local environmental action, but actually what happens if you recognise that they're actually doing a lot of innovation They're doing really innovative things in the sense that they're organising in novel ways. They're coming up with services or facilities or resources for their communities in novel ways. There's a lot of innovative stuff going on, and it's not in a kind of conventional business setting, obviously. So that's what kind of got us interested in what we called grassroots innovation, and we began trying to write about that, trying to raise money to investigate it and actually almost see what social science can learn from what people are doing, which is how it always works, really, I guess, and developing it. And then we soon learned that actually there are other people like Anil Gupta in India and all around the world, also investigating something that they called grassroots innovation. And so that's what led on this, I don't know, over time, of a somewhat disjointed journey of learning and dialogue. So yeah, and so we were sort of trying to learn from these initiatives and trying to think what that initially, and sort of gradually over investigating that, it kind of morphed a little bit from looking at local action as if they were doing innovative things to actually could help us rethink how we understand innovation in societies, if you like. Okay, so to open up and think of more diverse and alternative ways of doing innovation. And then that led to eventually a project with the STEP Centre a few years ago, and it's why we've got this initiative with WiredSussex, was because it was a series of 6 case studies that we wrote up into a book called Grassroots Innovation Movements. And there's a presentation recorded on the WiredSussex YouTube channel where I talk about that, and sort of some of the things we learned, if you like. So we looked at the people's science movements in India that's been trying to rethink and reappropriate science for local communities in different parts of India and make it work for them. We've also looked at the honeybee network in India, which has been about scouting and supporting inventors and innovators in villages across the country, and has been connecting in interesting ways with and informing the design of government programs to try and support grassroots innovation in the country. We looked at the development of maker spaces, hacker spaces, community workshops for digital fabrication as a sort of network and movement. There was also historical ones where perhaps these are networks of activity trying to develop interesting products and services that are no longer active. We wanted to learn about, well, why did they disappear? Why were they struggling? What's their legacy? Some key things that we've learned from this research, I think, is that obviously how innovation is sort of understood and approached can be very different. It's not necessarily always about scaling up. It's not necessarily always about commercializing even, or producing artifacts. Sometimes it's about, the important thing is about incubating the community involved. It's a sort of practical activity, more about community building. The ambition may be to actually spread and circulate capabilities and skills for doing things innovatively together, helping other communities of interest or place to be innovative. And so those sort of varieties, it's really important to understand, if you like, the purposes and understandings stuff, whether that's a community energy project or food, or even something with developing software for a platform to enable participation across groups. Understanding and rooting it in the time and place that's happening is really, really important. And that's important, I think, when it comes to maybe thinking about how other organisations whose job it is to promote innovation in society, government policies, programmes, local authorities, enterprise agencies and so forth, if they're interested in promoting innovation that's more inclusive, that reaches out to communities, then it's important that they understand this diversity of innovations as well, these different approaches, because some of their kind of tried and tested ways of supporting innovation may not be so appropriate for these initiatives. Okay, so maybe I'll leave it at that, and people can kind of ask questions or contribute.
Lots of the success stories I see are people who have been at it for years and years, trying to figure stuff out, learning as they go, building up their skill set, and then all of a sudden they're a success. And people see them as an overnight success, but the reality is they're not. They've been working for years, and then they so happen to launch something quickly, and they can create it quickly because they've built up the skills for it. And then it becomes this overnight success. But really, it's not. It's a 5 to 10 year kind of pathway to figuring things out. And I think that's what people need to do, to be honest. More often, it's just like a business or a community is not something that you can do overnight. So it's like, how can you build something that you'll have the energy to maintain, to keep going forward, and not lose interest, not lose hope. And for me, I quite often say that comes down to kind of focusing on things that you care about, things that inspire you, things that you want to see change happen. And yeah, going with that.
It takes time. It's definitely something we've found in our research, and not. What also takes time is almost the kind of community skills, if you like. I mean, we've looked at examples where there's been some low cost, accessible environmental monitoring sensors and platform developed, and it's sort of well-intentioned technology, but there's not an obvious kind of community of users for that. So there's been some, initial interest and curious, but then the kind of early use of it declines. And the example we were looking at then required a bit of a rethink, and to try and find a kind of community in a place where this sort of technology might work, had some sort of environmental issue. In this case, it was a noise issue. And so it just took time and workshops, getting to know the community and understanding how life worked in that neighborhood. And then actually through those discussions, that then also involved a rethink of how you do the technology as well. So it's almost like this, it's one of the challenges is finding spaces and processes to try and bring those two things together, the kind of community development and listening, and finding a motivated community that really want to use the technology to address, in this case, a noise problem, and codify the noise through sensors to then empower them to try and get changes made in the neighborhood from the council to reduce the noise loss. So it's those sorts of, that's kind of one thing I think is important is, and maybe from a kind of policy point of view, or something we could do in terms of in a societal way, is to think about how we can expand the places, the facilities, places where people can meet up and spend time discussing local issues and thinking later what sorts of technologies or skills can be brought in to help that. Rather like in the early 20th century, it was deemed a good thing to have public libraries, not simply so that people can learn how to read or get trained up for a specific job and be economically active. It was simply really, really valuable to have libraries and a reading culture for civic purposes as well, for the quality of your society. And I wonder if kind of spaces where people can learn how to read technologies or gather and prototype and experiment ought to be as recognized similarly as a public infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine almost like government-funded co-working spaces that double up as libraries, that double up as education centres. From what I see, generally, to get things to work, they have to start with people who want them to work. So if companies come in, or there's these products that come in and say, we have the solution for you, and they come in and try to fix stuff, it's just probably not going to work, because the people might not be interested, or they might get excited initially, and then the excitement will die out, and then they'll kind of move on to something else. But if it comes more from the aspect of the people in the community, where they're trying to build something, and then you can go in and support them because you spent the time with them, probably understanding what they need, then that probably has a higher chance of success.
Hello, everyone. I'm a director of a new and small local community organisation, so not for profit. And what we do is we look after our local green spaces, and our business plan contains things like engaging volunteers, improving mental health, engaging local businesses for various activities. But clearly a lot of people that we're engaging with are not tech savvy. And my question is, what can tech do for us to help us in our local community to grow our company, to grow our business, to grow our numbers of volunteers? That's the simple question, really.
Yeah. Tech for me is like, there's so much you can do that it becomes overwhelming thinking about it all. But at the end of the day, like, tech is great for communication, and for any community activity, you need to be able to communicate. So, I would look at it from that aspect, as that how can you use tech to communicate better with your people? Who are your people, and what technology do they have access to? If they don't have a laptop, then you need to think about that. I guess they probably have a phone. If that's the only thing they have access to, then you need to design what you build based around what they have access to. Otherwise, there's no point, right? So, I hate Facebook, but maybe all your people are on a local Facebook group, and that's what you use to build up, some kind of community. So it's like, you have to think about it from the people who you want to engage with, and community is, it's really hard to maintain. So, on top of that, you might want to think about, well, there's the people who volunteer, but then maybe there's the business people. So the business people probably are more open to maybe getting emails. So you probably want to think about, how can you devise like an email strategy that will support your business. And again, tech can support that. It's not too hard to get set up, but it takes a bit of time to kind of develop the skills. And then, like I say, setting up a website it's not that hard, and it's not if you know the tools to use. There's so many tools out there at the moment that you can kind of visually kind of put things together. But if it's disjointed, it's never going to work. So all comes back again to trying to think about all the pieces and how can you pull it all together to create an effective community strategy and communication strategy. And then on top of that, it's how connect it with ways for people to easily pay. That's another powerful thing that isn't too hard to set up, but you could get people to pay for things a lot easier and avoid a lot of admin overhead. So yeah, I mean that's kind of in a nutshell, but all of that is kind of good good modern community and communication practice. To make any change, you have to kind of be constantly having conversations with people. So I would start with having conversations face to face if you're doing a local thing, and then slowly figuring out how can you bring those conversations online if they make sense to have online.
Judith, be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. I mean, in some of the initiatives we've looked at, the innovation needn't involve technology always either. So maybe some it could be a sort of novel ways of organizing activity connected with a space, or even something about bringing different groups together, like there's been initiatives where sort of trying to get younger people volunteering, or people who would like to do gardening but don't have a garden, kind of making arrangements whereby they can get access to people who do have gardens that maybe through age or other reasons are no longer able to attend their garden. And the innovation is a social innovation. It's about bringing them groups together and figuring out how they can do those things safely. And I'm not saying that's I don't know anything about the green spaces you're looking out for, and I'm just trying to rapidly think of something that we've come across in the past that was vaguely connected with it. But I think there's, if you like, from a kind of grassroots innovation point of view, it's important to sort of think about that, how to kind of promote novelty and make use of new ideas and knowledge and put them to practice in all sorts of ways. But I don't know, maybe you were thinking more of, technology and digital technologies, and you tell me.
What cheers me is that both what Rosie said and what you've said, actually, we've already started to do. So what you've done is you've confirmed that we're doing all the right things. And we've also thought about very much working with young people, particularly because of mental health issues in the pandemic, but working with very young people anyway, getting kids into the green spaces, bug hotels, wildlife, making those connections. So thank you. You've actually confirmed what we need to do.
Whilst you might be disruptive kind of within Brighton, I wonder if there are other kind of, sister initiatives elsewhere with whom you can network. I mean, one of the things our research found is having access to networks, so other organisations that are running green spaces in the UK or even beyond the UK. And having, one of the challenges a lot with grassroots groups is one can be so busy trying to make it work that there's not a lot of time for kind of documenting the lessons and reflecting. But actually, that stuff's really, really important for contributing to networks and sharing with other organisations elsewhere to try and help them, learn from your experience and learn from one another, and even build up things like repositories of tools, even like tools around, techniques for engaging young people, say, and how you do that in different communities. And so with our research and grassroots innovation, it's sort of, there's learning about specific initiatives, but this, to what extent and how easy is it for those networks to build and to endure, if you like, and if enough people are interested, then people do find ways to make them happen. But being at a kind of science and innovation policy research unit, we're interested in thinking how there might be better support for those sorts of networking activities as well.
That's kind of how I built up Ministry of Testing. I looked for inspiration outside of the testing world to build it up, because I didn't want it to be like anything that already existed for testers. I just wanted it to be completely different.
And one of the interesting things that we've seen move across is actually ideas from software development, free software development, and sort of licensing arrangements there actually being taken up in seed development as a way of trying to come up with alternatives to most of the world's seeds for agriculture are developed and owned by a handful of multinational companies. And that has implications for reductions in the diversity of seeds around the world and how they get bred and so on and so forth, market power and concentration. And there's been a movement against that to develop open source seeds and actually using some of the open licensing and some of the techniques learned from free software in the breeding of seeds and helping with that. And there's been initiatives in particularly countries like Argentina where you've got strong biotech ag kind of dominating the market and shrinking the spaces for more conventional or participatory forms of seed development. And these open source seed licenses have been a good way of challenging that. And, it's an intriguing alternative way of organising and thinking about seed development that's come through grassroots innovation and mobilisation, if you like.
I had a question about code of conduct. So how do we keep groups safe? I run a Women of Colour group on Facebook, and there's about 650 people in that group. And it's just trying to manage so many different personalities, different backgrounds, making sure that you're looking after everybody. That's how I feel I'm supposed to hold the space for them all, and it doesn't always work because people sometimes feel not looked after or not listened to. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, it's probably like my worst part of like community building is like conflict and code of conducts, and I believe it's good to have like a code of conduct present, but I also believe that most people don't read them, so I think what's like most important is probably just like leading by example, and hoping that people just copy you, or the people that stay are the ones that they'll end up like copying your behavior. I see that a lot. Indie hackers, actually, if people start doing one kind of post, then that kind of post becomes popular for a while, but with like slight adjustments to it, different themes, for example. But yeah, and indie hackers generally is a very it doesn't have much hate going on at all, which I was quite worried about when I first joined. I was worried I was going to have to deal with a lot of tech bros and all of that, but there's actually very little of that, which I'm very thankful for. But a lot of that is just like the culture, so it's like defining the culture up front, and with the more people that understand that culture, the hopefully in theory the more other people will kind of stand up and help you manage any difficult situations.
But like not being the only person, I've got more admins that help me, but also it's not only my decision and only me that's holding it. That's the whole point of community. It's not supposed to be just one leader at the top, isn't it? Yeah,
and that can be tough. And I think it's important to think about that as you're building communities. Like, what do you want it to be like? What do you want to be responsible for? And I guess when I built up Ministry of Testing, I was always like looking to put responsibility on other people's shoulders. Not because like I didn't want the responsibility, but it's like it's more like helping other people develop as well, and helping them contribute, and helping them kind of have input into what the community is as well.
Maybe it's not so much the code of conduct, it's the manifesto. It's like, what do we stand for? What's our values? And then you have a sort of benchmark for what you can tolerate and what your community is all about. Otherwise it gets diluted, doesn't it?
You don't want a community where people come constantly to give advice, right? Because like you give advice and that kind of people like nod their head, agree, and say, oh yes, that's right. But it kind of closes down the conversation, right? Because you're kind of reading this thing and accepting what someone says. Whereas if you ask questions, that kind of opens up possibilities to the community. When you run a community, you need to always be starting discussions and asking questions. So over the years, I just started asking lots of questions, and then I took those questions to Twitter as well. But when you ask questions, people come back with answers that can surprise you. And those questions, the answers, end up educating everybody in the room, myself included. So I ask those questions to genuinely learn myself, but also for other people to learn and also converse and develop relationships. So it's like a lot of win-wins just from asking a question.
I mean, what's really interesting there is, some of our research, there's a lot of excitement about collective intelligence and how digital technologies and platforms allow that. But, well, we've been mentioning some of the social media. You also get collective conflict, maybe. But what you were saying, Rosie, about how to kind of create an environment or create a tone or even like a culture, this is how we operate this together, is hard work, and for all the kind of, I don't know, digitally enabled collective intelligence, there's sort of human relationships behind that you have to work at to create that kind of ethic or culture of working together collectively and co-producing, or new knowledge and sharing experiences and things like that.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time just hanging out with the community. Sometimes like days pass and I feel like I haven't done a lot. But really, I think it's if you lead a community, you have to get to know your people as best as you can.
So my question is about the relative importance in community building between online and real life activity. Because listening to you, Rosie, talking about the Minister of Testing, you talked about doing real life conferences as well. And I wonder, what do real life stuff bring to community building, and what do online and virtual stuff bring to community building, and what's the difference in your mind to what they bring to the party?
In real life, it's special, in my opinion. It's like, but I think, for me, I think the special part is combining the two in a like effective way. It's like keeping the conversation going. So like most conferences that I've been to, they host a conference once a year, and there's like zero communication, zero community in between the conferences. And then like as the conferences are coming up, emails are sent out. There's not a lot of interaction for people to keep in touch with each other. Whereas like with Ministry of Testing, the community was all year round, and then there was an event as part of it. And I think that's like part of the key reason why it worked, is because we just kept that conversation going all year round. And then when we had this conference, so all these people like would meet up, and it would be like they already knew each other, but they didn't, and they'd never met in real life. But it was still special, and they could still have a laugh, and they could just like almost immediately like get the conversation going. There's like no awkward silences, no like, oh, what's your name, or stuff like that. It's like they already knew a bunch of stuff, so they could like get past the small talk, I guess I would say. I think small talk, so many communities don't get past that small talk. And it's when you get past that small talk where special things happen. And when you have a conference that is, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 days, and you can get straight to the real talk, it becomes more meaningful and people can connect. But at the moment, I think there's potentially a lot of innovation that we can do in community building. Like with COVID that's happened, it's like how can we use tech and use like our natural human instincts and need to connect and need to understand each other, and how can we create these stronger communities with good tactical things. It's like all these things can be learned. It's not hard, but you just have to kind of like spend the time doing it.
I agree with Rosie. It's about how these two things interconnect and relate to one another, and how they're changing maybe, and trying to work out what it means for, I don't know, social mobilization or working collaboratively. One of the fascinating things with the whole kind of Fab Lab makerspace phenomenon has been how one can collaborate online by sharing instructions and code and designs and etc. But you're also collaborating with people in a shared workshop space in a neighborhood, or and there are also meetups and things like that. So how that kind of reconfigures things, if you like, is really interesting. And then even one bit of research we were doing was looking at citizen participation platforms. I think I've mentioned this to you before, Phil, but in cities like Madrid and Barcelona. So the idea was these are platforms that came through activism initially and evolved out of Reddit groups, but then doing more bespoke software development for online platforms where people can propose things, developments locally, and it's actually eventually incorporated it and developed by the council in both of those cities as a platform where people could propose policy measures for the city and debate them online and vote for them. And even now, each regularly they run online votes and consultations about how to spend tens of millions of euros of the public budget. Whichever's most popular becomes implemented by the council. So there's this platform, but what's been really interesting is as it left the world of activism and people really wanted to use these devices to coordinate producing manifestos or organising activism, as it moved from that into becoming a public resource for any citizen to engage with. The reasons for other citizens who weren't already committed and active to engage were less apparent, and it actually required offline activities and organising meetings, identifying issues of concern to people and organising events where they could discuss them and then propose them onto this platform as a way of getting support and action on them. So there were really interesting dynamics and the evolution of how the offline and the online kind of developed over time, if you like. And then what's interesting and relates to something I think Rosie said earlier, what has been really important for that is that the technology itself is open and seen almost as a commons, if you like. So it's adaptable, so the coordinating team and all the volunteers that help with this can adapt the platform and make it work better, given the experiences with trying to engage with people in neighbourhoods and what have you. And then also the other important offline element of it is implementing decisions reached on the platform and working with administrators in the councils to trust and accept and work with this device for improving your connection with the citizens who you serve, and figuring out how to implement the decisions taken and communicate that you're implementing it, especially if it's something like, I don't know, reforming a park or creating cycle lanes or safe houses for women, whatever the things that people have voted for. That takes time to then build and put in place. So
interesting to hear about that in Madrid and Barcelona. It reminded me of the recent consultation that the council have been doing down here about the cycle lanes and the closing of Madeira Drive and the kind of opposing factions you've got there. And the surveys apparently were kind of infiltrated, if that's the right word, by groups associated with the classic car rallies and the bike groups. And so you had people from outside of the area getting involved and contributing to these decisions. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on whether that sort of that consultation and that invitation to participate should be locked down more strongly in the way that, say, a general election is, or is it okay that people from outside of the immediate environment are contributing to these decisions?
So I think, if I remember rightly, how it worked in Madrid is you can contribute views from outside, but if you are to cast a vote on this platform, you have to demonstrate. There's a way of, you have to be resident, if you like. So it's bound in that sense. So if you like, the debate's open, but the decision is bound. But also, I think the important thing is sometimes this is about things that are done prospectively. And as I understand with the cycle lanes, they were kind of put in place and temporarily, and then there's a reaction against that both ways. People really in support of it, others opposed to it, and it's sort of been quite heated, hasn't it? So yeah, I don't know. So there are. But I guess your point, Dan, is that the organisation of these processes needs sort of thinking through, really.
Yeah, and it's an interest. I think it's just interesting to think whether it should be locked down to, should you have to provide your Brighton and Hove council tax number or whatever it might be in order to participate in that decision, or is it okay for people who meet up on a bike cafe somewhere up the A23 to be involved in this process as well?
I can definitely say, like, from my perspective, it's not the same context. But when I was building up Ministry of Testing, sometimes I would ask people what they thought of ideas. Like, I asked, like, before we did conferences, I would ask them, what do you think of me doing a conference for the Ministry of Testing? And most people came back and said, oh, no, that's a terrible idea. We don't need that. No one will pay. But But, you know, I went ahead anyways, because at the end of the day, I think in hindsight, what I realized is that I know the community the best. No one else has spent the time in the community like I have. I understand the industry, and therefore I'm very well equipped to make a decision for what I feel is best, and I'll stand by it and see what happens. Obviously, it's not the same situation as the council stuff and, you know, roads. But, you know, if I had left that down to the community to vote, I don't think I would have made the right decision.
But I see it as it's something that requires public investment in as well. You know, I think actually resourcing it and part of that means rethinking our innovation policies, if you like, so that there's a much stronger community building component in that. But in doing that, I was really struck by what Rosie said earlier, and actually when we were talking previously as well, about any public support like that shouldn't have too many strings attached. You know, it shouldn't be about imposing agendas on communities. It ought to just recognise the value and importance of creating spaces and resources for people to deliberate, develop communities, to be innovative, if you like. So providing, public support and underpinning that, but not too directed or instrumental a way. I mean, I think that's one take home for me, if you like.
For me, I guess it's about building community around something that you really care about and something that you're willing to stick with for the long term, and to keep going, keep experimenting, keep going, keep figuring stuff out, and be prepared for that long journey.
Thank you so much, Rosie and Adrian. Thank you to everyone who joined tonight, and thank you to University of Sussex, WiredSussex. This initiative was thanks to funding from the Economic and Social Research Council. Thanks to Professor Adrian Smith and Rosie Sherry, and hope you can all come to our next event in this series on the 25th of March with Professor Anne Light, who's on the call, and Anne Longley, who's also on the call. The theme is Designs to Reshape Humanity, which is all about Anne Light's new book. So I will see you then.